Good afternoon now. It's 12:05, so I think we'll get started. Welcome to Bioethics Grand Rounds. I'm Christian Berkler. Bioethics Grand Rounds is hosted by the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine, and it's organized by Amy Lynn, who's an essential component of that today's Administrative Assistant Appreciation Day. So I just want to appreciate Amy for all the hard work that she does in organizing this event. Thanks, Amy. So today we're really lucky to have Andy Shuman come talk to us. Andy is a fixture of the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine, and I'm lucky enough to be able to work with him in helping to organize the things we do around clinical ethics at the institution. Andy is a New Yorker who decided to come to the University of Michigan as an undergraduate student. He stayed here for medical school, where he excelled, and then got a very competitive and prestigious residency in otolaryngology here at the University of Michigan. He went on to Memorial Sloan Kettering to complete his head and neck oncology fellowship. He stayed there for an additional year to work with Joe Finns, a former president of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, where he did an ethics fellowship with Dr. Finns at Cornell. And then obviously we were lucky enough to recruit him back here to the University of Michigan, and where he does a number of things, including one of the things he's going to talk to you about today, which is working on rationing drugs. So he's going to talk about the ethical and practical approaches to drug shortages. Andy, thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Christian and Amy and everyone else for coming. Everybody hear me okay in the back? Great. So this is really a topic that I sort of fell into through my institutional and administrative roles, much more so than an initial academic interest. But what I'll try to convince you of over the next hour is just how complex, morally, ethically, and practically this issue is, and how challenging it can be to come up with the right answer when, quite frankly, there isn't always a right answer to be had. We think of drug shortages as something that doesn't necessarily affect us being a privileged developed nation in a quaternary care system. But what I'll tell you is that this is absolutely something that we deal with every day. And the only reason you don't hear about it every day is through the tireless efforts of many, many people at this institution who are doing everything possible to avoid the tragic choices that we sometimes have to make. So with that said, I have no disclosures. So I'm going to start with a story. And this is a very real story. This was a phone call that I received in January. So etoposide is a chemotherapeutic drug. So it's used for a bunch of different kinds of cancer. It's been around for a really long time, and it costs about $7 for a small vial. So anybody who knows anything about cancer drugs knows that that's a pretty good deal, right? Most cancer drugs are a whole lot more than that. So this is a tried and true medication that is standard of care treatment of many different kinds of cancer, from pediatric neuroblastoma to sarcoma to adult lung cancer to part of the bone marrow transplant preparation regimen to many, many others. So this is something that is used throughout the entire hospital, from babies to adults. And we ran out, is the bottom line. And it's not just we ran out, but the entire country has essentially run out of etoposide. So over the course of the next hour, I'm going to tell you how and why that happens. But first, what I'll tell you is the frantic phone call I got in January, which is we have about 100 patients currently receiving etoposide across the hospital, and we have enough supply currently at that day for about 70 of them. Plus, we anticipate at least 6 or so patients a week who will likely need to start this drug. And what do we do? And needless to say, every single member of every single cancer group, from MOT to adult to the cancer center, was frantic about making sure that their patients received it. So the questions that are posed are kind of what you would think about. Is this a matter of if someone's on it, they stay on it? Do we stop any new starts? Do we ration based on age? Do we ration based on dose? Do we ration based on indication? Do we ration based upon other variables? Do VIPs get special access? Do people who have different kinds of insurance get special access? How do we deal with this? And the bottom line is, this is not a educational, I mean, it sounds like a great thing to ask a bunch of med students in a classroom, but this really happens. And that day, we needed to make a decision about how we were going to deal with a critical shortage of a drug that doesn't have great alternative. So think about etoposide over the course of the next half hour while I go through some of the background, and we'll come back to it at the end. So what I'm going to do is describe a little bit about why this happens and how it happens and the scope of the problem, a little bit of Ethics 101 of how to think about the problem, and then we'll apply this to real-life example. So that's what I'm going to do. So drug shortages are not just a problem in the developing world. They are not a historical problem. They are a current problem. And one really complicated part of this is that this is a societal problem, but it's also an immediate issue at the bedside. And it's sometimes hard to separate those two from each other. But it's one thing to say, gosh, it would be great if we had enough for everyone, but we need to decide which categories of people need this. But it's yet another for an oncologist to call you and say, Mrs. Jones is in my clinic. Why won't you give me enough drug to treat her? And one of the problems here is that it's very difficult for an individual clinician to be put in that very difficult situation of how do I treat my patient best, but also potentially be a steward for resources that are scarce broadly. What complicates this even more is that it cannot be answered just at the bedside or by an institution, but the politics, the economics, and legislative and regulatory components of this make it even more complicated broadly. So this is my slide just to prove that this is not a small problem. So what we're looking at here is data from 2001 to last year, and this is number of drugs on shortage. And to clarify, this is not the number of times a drug is on shortage, but this is absolute numbers of medications per year that are unavailable in the United States. So another way to look at this is roughly 150 separate different medications are not available at some point in time over the course of a year in the United States, broadly speaking. Some of these drugs are rare and not used that frequently. Others are ubiquitous. Etoposide is one that is not quite ubiquitous, but is used very broadly. And obviously, you see how this has changed over time. You can see there was an escalation in 2009, 10, 11, and then things got a little better. I'll talk a little bit about why that happened, but needless to say, this is still a problem now. So this came out in the New York Times last year, a year and a half ago now, talking about how drug shortages are the new normal in American hospitals. And again, it's not as if anything changed dramatically in 2012 and 2016, but this is when this made the front cover of the New York Times. I'll let you read these quotes. I think they're nicely illustrative. This is straight from the article. So it's generally bad when the New York Times says that we've been forced into a highly unethical corner, right? That usually means that extra work for ethicists. And then Dr. Lurie, who works on emergency preparedness for the feds, her comment was interesting, which is that different places around the country are doing their best to patch together different guidelines if they're doing anything at all. So one of the giant problems here is that every institution is trying to solve this in a reactive rather than a proactive way. So the next obvious question is, well, what's not available? And the short answer is it's a very broad group of agents that are not available. Again, this is just more granular, showing you that it's focused upon antibiotics, anti-cancer drugs, neurological drugs, and then electrolytes. And then your next obvious question is, how do you run out of electrolytes, right? How do you not have potassium or salt water? And I'll answer that in about 3 slides. Sorry, 1 slide. So the issue here is that there are a number of different things that make something unavailable. And the most common category of what's not available is actually we don't know. So your next question, of course, is how do you not know what's available? Or what isn't available and why? Part of this gets into the economics. And generally speaking, it's generics that are least available. And it's generally cheap, old, proven drugs. And the reason for that is because cheap, old, proven drugs are not particularly revenue generating for companies. So the only way you make money off of selling something that's dirt cheap is what? to sell a lot of it, right? And to not have that much competition. So generally what that means is that there's 1 or 2 or 3 generic companies that will produce in large quantities something that is pretty cheap. I don't know, say a bag of IV saline, and sell millions of them, right? But the only way you're going to be able to make money, even if you're selling millions, is if you're not wasting it, which means you don't have a surplus, which means you don't have a large supply that's about to go get expired, and that you don't have too much competition. And also that you probably are efficient in making it. And what I mean by efficiency is you make it in 1 or 2 places, not a bunch of different factories. But what happens when one of those places, oh, I don't know, is hit by a hurricane? So the hurricane in Puerto Rico took out Baxter's supply that made supply chain, manufacturing center, and storage of IV electrolyte and saline bags. And that move in and of itself completely devastated the market. The economic priorities I just talked about. And there are other issues. So for example, this is the requisite slide that shows you the numbers, that manufacturing is second most common, which is what I just talked about, but only second to not knowing. And the reason we don't know often is because many of these companies are publicly traded, and a publicly traded company is not necessarily going to advertise why they can't make something. To say, our equipment is outdated, or we screwed up in the factory, or we have contaminations of huge amounts of our lots, because shareholders don't necessarily want everyone hearing that. So unless there is a reason, regulatory reason, why they need to disclose that, they're not necessarily going to. And what you often think of is, well, maybe you don't have the raw materials to make it. That does happen, but that is 1 or 2 drug shortages a year, not 150. So this is somewhat of what I just said, but there's this perverse disincentive to make things that work really well and are cheap, which sounds ridiculous, but it's true. So drug companies in general are incentivized to make really expensive stuff that's brand new and exciting. But it's the $8 vial of the tried and true chemotherapeutic drug that, quite frankly, is not the cash cow that is going to generate revenue. And as a result, there's 2 or 3 companies that make it. And one or two of those has a problem, it completely devastates availability. So the next question you have is, well, there's so many drugs, does it really actually impact what happens to people? And my short answer is yes. And my longer answer is on this slide. So this is showing from a pediatric lymphoma consortium what happened when a tried and true dirt cheap chemotherapeutic drug became unavailable. So methchlorothamine is a little more expensive than etoposide, but it's still a couple $100 a vial, which is nothing. And it was part of what was called the MOP lymphoma protocol. And I should make my disclosure, I'm not an economist, I'm not a health science researcher, and I'm not a hematologist, but I'll oversimplify. So MOP is a protocol in which MOPP stands for 4 different drugs. The M is methchlorothamine. This is part of the cocktail that's used to treat certain kinds of pediatric lymphoma. So they ran out of the M. So what did they do? They said, well, instead of MOP, we're going to use COP. So they replaced methchlorothamine with cyclophosphamide, another tried and true chemotherapeutic drug. A drug that had been used before, but had never really been compared head to head. But generally speaking, people thought it would work. So what did they do? They replaced it because they didn't have another option. But one nice thing about pediatric cancer consortia is that they have prospective data following what happens over time. And for those who don't, is my mouse working? Good. For those who don't read Kaplan-Meier curves, survival is the y-axis, time is the x-axis, time 0 is the time from treatment, and this is years. And this is the number of patients whose cancer recurred over time. So what they found out 4 years later was, holy crap, MOP works a whole lot better than COP. And the other way to look at this is at 4 years, or I'm sorry, let's say at 2 years, about 12% of people who received MOP had their cancer recur, and about 40% of people who received COP had their cancer recur. Now, not all of them died, but I'll tell you, if you're a parent of a kid with lymphoma, you'd much prefer them to have gotten MOP versus COP. And again, I'm oversimplifying this example, but what I'm hopefully painting a picture for is that when we make trade-offs and deal with alternatives with drug shortages, we don't always know whether or not we're giving something that's equivalent. And this is a perfect example of a time when we didn't. So there's another wrinkle with chemotherapy. I don't want to dwell on this, but I will say that the money here is something that is worth talking about. So there's a perverse reimbursement schema in oncology in which there's a reimbursement associated with the cost of your medication. And part of that is associated with the fact that it actually costs money to have an infusion center and to provide all of the resources necessary to give drug. So it's appropriate for there to be a markup. But what it creates is an incentive to give things that are more expensive, because that markup is based upon the cost of the drug, not based upon the cost of doing business. So what that means is specifically, and I'm not picking fingers at anyone in particular, but in the private world where individual practices are bringing in reimbursements and actually seeing that money directly, there's an incentive to give the expensive stuff, the new expensive stuff. And that in and of itself can impact drug shortages, availability, and the cost of doing business. With that said, that's not the only problem here, and there's a lot of counterclaims to be made to this, but I'm just kind of painting the economic and practical picture here of how complicated this gets. So how many people are affected by this in the country? Well, a lot, millions. So in 2012, propofol was on shortage. So this is a ubiquitous drug used in anesthesia, and there were supply side issues with the lots, and it was generic, so it was cheap. And 96% of anesthesiologists in 2012 had to change the way they put people to sleep because they ran out of the drug. So that just gives you a sense of the scope there. That's one example, one drug. Another issue is that clinical trials cost millions and millions of dollars to conceive, plan, and run. And when you run out of a drug mid-trial, that is a huge problem. So in 2010 and 11, there were 23 multi-center prospective trials, each of which cost at least $10 million that had to be postponed or stopped because they ran out of one of the trial drugs. So suffice to say, not only are the patients and the subjects who are involved in that research being adversely impacted, but the money, the sheer amount of money that is wasted getting those trials off the ground and then having uninterpretable data because all of these patients had protocol lapses is a huge issue. And then one of the more egregious examples is in Virginia, they actually ran out of one of the paralytic drugs used in anesthesia because it was stockpiled by prisons to be able to have them for capital punishment. Another way to look at this is it's not just drugs. We run short on things all the time: ICU beds, blood, organs, oxygen, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and vaccines. So there's a lot of things that are proven to work that are dirt cheap that we run out of. And rationing schemas apply. One thing that's different about drugs, though, is they affect people in ways that are unpredictable, and they happen very quickly, which makes it very difficult to react. And they also affect tertiary and quaternary care centers, not quite as much, but frequently enough that we need to deal with this on a daily basis, and it's part of our reality of doing business. But no one in this room is accustomed to saying no to someone because we don't have something available. So this is the saline example. These mini bags of IV fluid went on shortage when Baxter's plant was disrupted by the hurricane last year. We're still suffering from this. And you might say, well, gosh, can't you just use a bigger bag or change the way you give drugs? And the short answer is yes, and we do. So I don't necessarily think any patients at University of Michigan were hurt by this. But what I will tell you is this has dramatically impacted our way of doing business. So something as simple as we used to put a medication in this little bag and hang it is now complicated by the fact a nurse needs to do more. It's more work. It's more steps to dilate or administer a medication, which obviously takes time and also potentially sets someone up for errors, right? The more steps that are involved, especially if they're unnecessary steps, increases the chance of having a problem with just the math or the flow or contamination or anything else. And then the other issue here is that because these bags are unavailable, it means we have to run pumps and infusions more when we didn't otherwise have to. So Michigan Medicine actually had to buy and rent more infusion pumps in order to deal with this. So the downstream effect here is that this has cost the University of Michigan hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to work around the fact that we don't have these silly little plastic bags full of sterile saline. So again, just one example, but one that's showing that hundreds of hours of manpower, from nurses to pharmacists to administrators, have been applied to renting machines that we otherwise wouldn't need and wasting time that could otherwise be dedicated to patient care to make up for the fact that not enough companies are making these cheap little bags because it's not cost effective enough for them. So that was my very oversimplified summary of the economics here, which, again, I don't want to dwell on, but I think is necessary to talk about in order for us to be able to move forward with the conversation into the ethics. So this kind of came to a head in 2011 because the number of drug shortages in the prior year was astronomically higher than it had been. It was over 200 drugs a year. It was raised to the level of the federal government. Obama's initial response was an executive decree that led in what I would consider now lightning fast speed to a federal act or a federal decision that led to a congressional act. So the FDA SIA was passed in 2012 with full bipartisan support that was partially dedicated to solving this. And what they said, among other things, in 1,000 pages, was that drug manufacturers need to inform FDA in real time when there's a shortage, right? Which they otherwise wouldn't do because, again, it can impact their stock and public relations. But now they were regulated and had to. So the first thing that did is when a company has supply side issues or contamination of a lot or just chooses to stop making something, they have to tell the federal government. And the federal government then can mobilize resources in order to make more or avail resources of more. And there's other ways of dealing with that. So for example, foreign suppliers that are not FDA approved are not able to import drugs to the US, right? For quality control reasons, for many other reasons. But what this law said is if there's a critical shortage of something, at least temporarily, we will allow foreign drug to be imported and used with FDA oversight. So that's one way around it. The other way around it is that they actually relax some patent laws and let people make things that were not protected by a patent if the company that had the patent was unable to make it. And again, there were a number of other regulatory and procedural components of this law that were designed to try to improve this problem. And there's a nice picture of the law. Okay, so let's get into the ethics. So ethics 101, let's use principles, right? So autonomy, beneficence, helping people, not hurting people, and providing the best care to everyone available. So what's the problem with drug shortages? Well, every single one of these is involved, and they directly conflict. So principlism is a very effective way to describe the problem here, but doesn't necessarily get us to a solution, right? Because every individual patient and every individual clinician is going to want to honor and empower their autonomous decision to get what they need to do good, but how do we do that when there's simply not enough to go around? And the other way to look at this is from a kind of basic justice standpoint of what do you do when you don't have enough for everyone, right? What do you do when you have 10 hungry people and 8 slices of pizza? So rationing, right, the R word is not a dirty word because we do it all the time. The question is, how do we do it, right? So in the United States, we ration, generally speaking, based upon access and ability to pay, right? Which is a default way of rationing that, quite frankly, isn't necessarily fair, but it's the way we do things here. But when it comes to shortages, we have to change the way we do things. And the idea here is that the basics of distributive justice stipulate that you need to have some system whereby we treat people equally, we're transparent, and we make decisions, either utilitarian decisions or communitarian decisions or other ways of working through these dilemmas in order to come up with a schema. And at the bedside, we do the best that we can. But the problem at the bedside is that every individual clinician is always going to do the best thing that's possible for their patient, right? So when I'm wearing my ethics committee hat, I might very well think more broadly about what's best for Michigan medicine patients. But when I'm sitting in my office with a patient who's desperate to fight his or her cancer, I'm going to bend over backwards and do anything I possibly can to make sure that patient gets that drug, because that patient is my responsibility more so than my responsibility to the greater good or the masses. So what this means is that every physician, even when practicing within a fair rationing schema, cannot and should not absolve their duty to their individual patient. But what that also means is that whatever rationing schema you come up with has to transcend that dyad. And what I mean by that is you need a rationing schema that is broader and applies to all and takes that individual clinical judgment and obligation out of the picture. Because we know that if any individual clinician is asked whether or not their patient should get their drug, the answer is always going to be yes, or should always be. So how do we ration? Well, we used to do it, or currently do it, by access, availability, and ability to pay, whether or not someone has insurance, whether someone can afford their co-pays. But it's different when we're actually coming up with a formal set of criteria, such as we do for drug shortages. And one issue here is we need to take into account stakeholders, and I'll talk about what that means in practice. And also recognize that, again, with my etoposide example, I have no idea if we're going to get a shipment in 2 weeks, or 4 weeks, or 8 weeks. So am I making a rationing schema for today, or one that takes into account the fact that our supply may evolve over time? Or 8 patients, not 6 patients, are going to be diagnosed next week who need it. Or it's weight-based, so maybe someone who weighs a lot is going to come in and suck up a huge amount of dose availability in a way that is completely unanticipated from if 6 little kids come in. And I'll come back to that in a second. And the other, again, I made this point already, that individual clinical judgment cannot be the barometer by which we make these decisions. So when we come up with a rationing schema, I would argue that, or I have argued, that there are 4 ways to do it, right? So it has to be evidence-based as much as possible, although remember the mop cop example tells us we don't always have the evidence to know. It needs to be transparent, meaning that this cannot be done in a boardroom. This has to involve everyone who needs to be involved, and they all need to be aware of it. It has to be universal, right? No special people, right? And it has to be objective. We don't do this based upon societal worth, or I think this guy deserves it more, or that guy has 3 kids, or that woman's in jail, right? Those are not fair or objective ways of thinking about who gets what. But the devil's still in the details, right? So what do you do when there's not comparative data, right? What about amount of drug, right? Weight-based dosing is a perfect example of that, right? What's most benefit? Is that QALYs? Is that quality adjusted life years? Is that the % likelihood of cure? Is that the availability of an alternative option, whether that's equivalent or inferior or unproven? If the alternative option is considered to be just as efficacious, but with more side effects, how do we think about that as a differential? What about age, right? Kids first or not? Do we just go straight up first come, first served? What about the evolution of supply? And how do we think about people on clinical research protocol, right? All completely relevant questions to muddy the waters. So Duke University wrote up their approach in 2012. I think it's a nice schema. It's not unique anymore, but what they said is that the ethics committee came up with a guideline to say that things need to be transparent, relevant. There needs to be a built-in appeals process. It has to be broadly enforced, and it has to be fair, right? Very similar to what I just said. And again, these are very easy to put on a slide in bullets. It's much harder to make these decisions in real life with real drug examples, what we're going to do next. So what they did is they created a multidisciplinary committee. They involved ethics, pharmacists, many other groups, and they meet when there's a shortage. And this was the first model of how this was done that was published at least about 6 years ago. And I'll talk about what we do here shortly. So I'll give you the easy example first. So this is a nice easy example from their paper. So preservative-free methotrexate. Methotrexate is an immunoregulator and chemotherapeutic drug that's dirt cheap. There's a preservative-free version of it that has very narrow indications. It's generally given for leukemia, sarcoma, and in certain autoimmune situations. And in this particular situation, their shortage was such that they said, great, we are going to give it to people with osteosarcoma and acute leukemia. We are not giving it to anyone with autoimmune disease or anyone with incurable cancer, right? Only curative intent regimens for sarcoma and leukemia get it. And the pharmacy representative sitting on this committee said, well, this is weight-based, and they come in 50 milligram vials. So can we say that we're going to round down by 10%, right? So if somebody's weight-based dose is 60 or 58 milligrams, instead of wasting that second vial, we're going to round down, right? A very pragmatic, simple solution to try to save some vials. And again, a very oversimplified example of what they did in that specific case. What I'll tell you is etoposide is much more complicated, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about why and how. So the next question is, well, can you do this broader? So the answer is yes. There's a Canadian approach that is provincially based that basically takes an algorithm that's similar to an institutional approach, but applies it broader to a province. So do you deal with the supply? You deal with elective procedures or treatments. This was done during the propofol shortage, so it's a little focused on anesthesia, but it still applies more broadly. And then they go through a complicated rationing schema, which I don't want to dwell on other than to say that this has been thought of, at least in a socialized controlled system like a provincial Canadian healthcare system, in a way that was, again, you might argue about some of the ways they did things in the details, but it's transparent, it's universal, it's objective, it's evidence-based, it's thoughtful. The next issue is the market. And one issue here is that at the University of Michigan, we employ pharmacists whose only job it is to obtain scarce drug. That's what they do. They make sure we don't run out. What I can tell you is the small community hospital in the Upper Peninsula doesn't have that ability, right? The other thing is that drug companies like working with the University of Michigan because we're a really good customer, right? We give them a lot of money. So when we call them and say, gosh, what do you have extra that we can buy from you? They may be a little more willing to sell it to us than to the small hospital that doesn't do as much business. So what this means is that big, wealthy centers like ours, unfairly, you might argue, do better at maintaining a supply and getting the extra scarce drug, more so than the smaller hospitals and centers. Now, you might say that that's part of being the leaders and the best, right? That part of what you get when you come to Michigan is those resources. But you can also say, gosh, isn't that unfair for the cancer patient in the Upper Peninsula who doesn't have the resources to come here, right? And the short answer is yes, it is. Right, so the next question, of course, is, do we give it to the women and children first, right? It's whoever gets in the lifeboat gets the drug. Well, it depends where you are. So there's a couple of issues with age, right? So one is that if you save a child's life, you're potentially saving more quality adjusted life years than you are for an adult. But there's other issues too. The data in kids is usually not as strong, right? Because it's harder to do clinical trials in pediatrics. Is dose an issue? Right? We can potentially give it to more children than adults if it's a weight-based dose, assuming the vials are not the issue. And depending on where you are in the world, this is variable. So I love this slide. So Germany versus Sweden. And this was a public survey of whether or not age should impact rationing choices, right? And in Germany, it's a very strict, age doesn't matter, first come, first serve, right? Whereas in Sweden, the majority of the public was willing to sacrifice the lives of 35 70-year-olds to save one 30-year-old. Right? These countries are 1,000 miles away from each other. Right? So the idea here is how we as a society determine whether age as a rationing variable dramatically varies. And again, there's a whole cadre of literature on this that I'm not summarizing, but I'm just providing an example of the fact that this is not as well deliberated or agreed upon as you might think. So briefly, international stuff. WHO has a very nice way of thinking about this in that there is a list of what are the vital drugs that every country should have, which is kind of an interesting way to think about it, right? So what needs to be in your cupboard, right? And it's more relevant, of course, to the developing world. But the idea here is what are the drugs that are broadly usable, cheap, have long shelf lives, don't need to be refrigerated, have multiple indicated uses, and really work. And the idea there is if you only have a certain amount of money to buy drug, those are the ones you want to buy. You don't want to buy the super expensive fancy stuff with a narrow list of indications. And this is a list that's publicly available and has been updated every couple of years for the last 40 years. And again, it doesn't solve the problem, but at least it gives people a sense of what is really important. And obviously, the drugs that are on this list are going to be produced at higher quantities because, again, even generic companies will know that there's going to be a big market. HIV in Africa, I don't want to dwell on it other than to say that one of the variables here is that retroviral drugs are expensive and that they are difficult to determine who should get them. And again, sub-Saharan African nations have had very different responses. Again, this is from the 1990s mostly, but in South Africa and Zimbabwe for a long time, there was a public statement by elected officials that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, so we don't need antiretrovirals, period. Whereas in Botswana, they actually nationalized the entire safari program and used the revenue to pay for antiretrovirals for every single person in their country. Right? And these countries are basically border each other. The other thing that is worth mentioning is PEPFAR. Regardless of your politics, George W. Bush's allocation of $15 billion to the AIDS epidemic single-handedly saved millions and millions of lives. And regardless of where you stand in the international health world, people routinely recognize PEPFAR as a shining example of what the United States was able to do with well-allocated and thought-through resource allocation. I'm going to skip that just for time. And that's depressing, so I'll skip that too. So let's go back to the bedside. So now what? So let's talk a little bit about what we do here. So what we do here is we have the heroes of this, which are members of our pharmacy service. There's a huge number of people who do this, and it is an absolute yeoman's job to look at our supply, to look at what's expiring when, to look at what we anticipate needing over the course of the next couple of weeks or month, and making sure that we don't run out. Shannon Ho is one of the people who does this. There's a ton of others, but I'm going to call her out by name because I know firsthand how many hundreds of hours she's dedicated to doing this. There's members of our committees that work to try to figure out how to do this. So the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, you get these emails every once in a while saying, guess what, we're short on IV opioids. It would be great if we can allocate for this specific indication. And often we can do so in a way that doesn't adversely impact patient care through careful allocation of the resources in thoughtful ways. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes we have the etoposide example. So what we have now is a multidisciplinary task force and subcommittee. Pharmacy and therapeutics and ethics work together. We have clinical ethicists, pharmacists, physicians, legal counsel, compliance, pharmacists, and members of the community all sitting on this committee. We meet monthly, and we deal with these situations. We first came up with a charter of how we're going to deal with them. And what we do is we come up with processes and frameworks for what to do. This applies to shortages. It also applies to really expensive stuff. And that's out of the context of what I'm talking about today. But the other thing that we do is what do we do with the $100,000 a dose chemotherapeutic drugs? How do we decide whether or not we're going to use it, who gets it, what the allocation schema is, how much of a copay we're willing to accept, how much are we willing to pay up front, and so on. So all of these issues of the ethics of medication access and utilization fall within our purview. Again, shortages are a huge part of that, but not the only part of that. The money here is important to recognize. So the amount of dollars nationally that go to this, so these are woefully underestimated numbers. But for what it's worth, acquisition cost of pharmaceuticals is about $100 million a year 14 years ago. We haven't updated the study. My argument is it's probably going to be double now. Personnel costs for managing these drug shortages are hundreds of millions of dollars. And then hospital systems are absorbing extra costs too. One summary shows that about 2 out of 3 hospitals in the country has at least 6 figures expenditures purely related to drug shortages each year. At Michigan, it's way more than that. And then there's the non-financial impact, right? So there's a huge amount of time that goes into this, right? Drug procurement and allocation, we have full FTEs dedicated to this, right? Writing these policies is not easy. To do so in a thoughtful, deliberate way takes time. You need a whole lot of people in that room because it's really important for me not to just say I'm the ethics police and here's what we're going to do, but rather to make it an iterative process. And then there's the clinical component, right? So all of these clinicians are going to have to talk to their patients and talk about the shortage, come up with solutions, come up with alternatives, have very heart-wrenching conversations face-to-face about what this actually means in practice. And then, of course, there's the cost to families and patients of inferior treatment, of lost sleep over not being able to get what they want, of concern of should I try to go to another hospital, of anger at why is my team not giving me what I need, of abandonment of I've been on this last week and now you're telling me I can't get my next dose, and so on. Another issue that is not well done at all is recognizing that we do not exist in a vacuum. And the University of Michigan, again, we have a very thoughtful process to deal with this. But I'll be very honest, I don't have a good sense of what's being done across the street or across the state. And every hospital is dealing with this individually without a centralized effort, not necessarily to come up with one set of rules, but even something to know what the other hand is doing, right? I don't know if Botsford happens to have a huge supply of something without calling them directly. I don't know if St. Joe's has a much better rationing schema that we're not applying. I don't know if patients are getting very different answers at Genesis than they are here when it comes to what's going to whom. And one thing that I would love to be able to work on is coming up with a better way for us to work interinstitutionally within the state or the region to do this better. And this is a subject of a grant that we have in to try to look at this, and hopefully I'll come back in a year or two showing you what we've been able to do. First, they have to give us the money. So what are the take-home points? Well, drug shortages are very common. They're complex on a bunch of different levels. That prevention and anticipation of the shortages help, but they haven't solved the problem. That rationing schema need to be evidence-based, transparent, objective, and universal. And that this takes a lot of work by a lot of different people to solve in a thoughtful, deliberated way. So now let me tell you a little bit more about etoposide. So we have enough dose for about 2/3 of the people currently on treatment, right? It's January and everybody's up in arms. So what do? Well, we got all the right people in the room first. We convened our group and we met the next day. And then we arranged a conference call involving hospital administration and leadership, along with all of the cancer center directors and folks who actually, not just directors, but the clinicians who are part of the multidisciplinary care teams that are using these in different ways. And we basically said, we don't have enough for everyone that's currently on treatment. So there's no new starts. Nobody, even those with curative intent, are not allowed to start treatment starting today. And since we don't have enough for everyone, we are going to draw the first line at curative versus palliative intent. So patients who do not have the likelihood or the expectation of curative treatment will not get drug, even if they got it last week. You can imagine those are the hardest phone calls to make. And that we will continue treatment currently for those on treatment receiving curative regimens, but not open up anything else until we get more drug. Then we came up with a rationing schema to anticipate the fact that we were likely going to get more, but not enough. So what we said is that the first line that we will open it for is for curative intent patients without alternatives. And generally speaking, in this world, that was pediatric malignancy. The next rationing tier would be those needing curative intent treatment that had inferior alternatives, inferior based upon either perceived efficacy or more toxic regimens. And after that, we would open it up to palliative regimens in this particular case. Now, that sounds like a very simple, easy solution. This took literally hundreds of hours to work through, and lots of lost sleep by lots of different people. So then it gets a little more confusing, because the next week we got a call frantically from Mott that there was a toddler diagnosed with a very aggressive cancer for which this drug was an absolute essential component of her curative intent treatment. And what an absolutely heroic pharmacist did was calculate the leftover half cc in the allocated vials, weight-based, of what was being wasted or left over at the bottom of each little vial, and came up with enough drug within the leftovers of however many vials over the course of that week's treatment to cobble together a sufficient weight-based dose for this kid. But the question was, we had a rationing schema now, right? Our rationing schema said we are not doing no new starts. And another part of a rationing schema is that it is fair, universal, objective, and absolute. So the next question was, well, gosh, if we make an exception for this kid, is that problematic? Are we violating what we're about? So again, we met again, we talked about this, and what we decided was that this would be wasted anyway. This is not being refunneled or redistributed from someone else to this kid. That this is an extraordinary situation based upon a heroic pharmacist's effort to make this dose available, and that we needed to be transparent and say what we were doing, but that we were going to allow it. And we did, and the kid got curative intent treatment. So I'm running out of time, and I want to leave enough time for comments and questions. So what I'll tell you in the epilogue to etoposide is that we have more drug available now. We are still watching our supply very carefully, so every new start needs to be vetted through our group, but that thankfully we're in a situation where we're not turning patients away anymore, but it's not completely resolved either. Thank you very much. Sir. Yeah, it's a really cool idea. It came out of Utah, I believe. And literally what they did is they're saying, if we can't get this supply because of market reasons, we're going to build our own. And I think it's a really novel concept. The challenge of it is obviously the practicality and the financial kind of need to pony your money up, which is a huge amount of money. There's a liability issue. And there's conflict of interest issues as well if you're selling the product that you're making. They are working through it, and I think it's a really novel, interesting concept. It only is going to work for large conglomerate hospital groups and associations just because of the amount of money that needs to go into it, or big groups are going to need to come together to do so. But I'm intrigued, and I think it's really interesting, and I'm excited to see whether it moves forward. My gut feeling is if it's successful, we'll see more of them, but this is going to be the guinea pig to find out. I don't want to overstate. I don't know enough of the details to make a detailed answer, other than my gut feeling is that they're looking at generics that are relatively easy to produce and in relatively high demand that are not made by many companies. But I can't give you more details than that. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So just for those listening or the tape, the question is, how do you tell somebody they're not getting the drug, and who tells them? And this was really complicated for us. So what we determined was that the best thing was for the clinicians who knew these people to do so, that this was not a job for a pharmacist, this was not a job for an ethicist, this was not a job for a trainee, but that the attending oncologist taking care of these patients had to do so. However, with our Cancer Center communications group, we came up with talking points, we came up with a hotline, we worked directly with these individuals to make sure it was being done as clearly and as compassionately as possible. But that was a key component of this, not just with regard to the optics of what it looks like, but really with regard to how do we have very difficult conversations and not put people in an uncomfortable situation any more so than they're already in. Not really. Most of it went through the individual cancer clinics, and they had our talking points, and we were working with them. I think some of those practical components went through the Cancer Center comm people, and honestly, I might just be ignorant to how much they did behind the scenes. But I guess my honest answer is not that much of it after that component came through me. Anybody in the audience who has been directly affected by either etoposide or others that wants to share their comments or criticisms? We're almost out of time for criticisms, but we have time for comments. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect example of the fact that clinicians cannot be the rationers, right? Because we are not rational when it comes to what should happen to our own individual patient. We're going to bend the rules, and we are going to fight to get our patients what they need. The answer to that, of course, is institutionally, we need to look at, is this an appropriate allocation? Should we be reallocating or rethinking about who's eligible? And if we truly believe that these individuals are not eligible, then we need to close that loophole. The answer certainly isn't to be punitive about it, but rather to recognize that clinicians are going to do everything they possibly can within their ability to be their patient's advocate. So it's really more, in my mind, a testament to your trainees than it is anything else. Great. Sir. The problem with lottery systems is that it's not as if there's 10 patients waiting in line at the same time. So the timing of it is such that supply and demand ebb and flow in ways that are so unpredictable that you can't just do it that way. The only other option would be first come, first serve. So that's the quote unquote fairest way of allocating in that setting. But most individuals in this world take at least a little bit of a utilitarian perspective, even if not purely so, where we're going to create categories of those who we determine are either going to benefit the most or have the most standing for something. But it's usually, at least in what I've experienced, much more of a timing problem, why a true random lottery wouldn't apply as well. Last question. Yeah, you're up. Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I don't have a great answer, to be honest with you. I think individual clinicians are tasked with communication of risks, benefits, alternatives, and so on a routine basis. We improvise all the time in medicine, right? Not everything that we do is algorithmic or evidence-based, right? I think it depends upon whether something is viewed as an alternative that is inferior or not. So again, mop versus cop, people truly didn't believe that one was worse than the other until 2 years down the road, we got that data. So I think that's one challenge of this, is that we improvise in ways that are non-evidence based all the time, and we don't necessarily always know if we're doing so in a way that is creating untoward or unintended consequences. Thank you all for your time.